Hello and welcome to the March 2023 ENSO seminar. You're very welcome, and I would like to welcome our speaker this month, Ed Baggs. Ed Baggs is in the Center for Human Interactivity Research in Odense in Denmark, and comes with an interestingly eclectic background and history from psycholinguistics to philosophy of ecological psychology and cognitive science, through a school of architecture and some sidelines into philosophy of neuroscience and elsewhere too. So a sort of quintessentially cognitive scientific interdisciplinary sort of braiding of approaches and disciplines there, or backgrounds there, Ed. So kind of a nice prototypical example of a cognitive scientist at work. So
yep.
Thanks a million for coming in, and you're very welcome. So we can sort of get started pretty quickly. I think there's a sort of a couple of people will be joining us. Mark Mercurgo will be here for some live discussion later on, and we might see whoever else happens to pop in if and when they do. I'll be, as ever, keeping an eye on the YouTube chat. So for those of you who are watching live, I want to add comments or pass along questions to Ed during the Q&A session towards the end of the discussion or towards the end of the session, and I'll relay your comments into the conversation. Okay, so I guess without further ado then, Ed, we can kick things off. So I'll invite you to share your screen and present the March 2023 ENSO seminar on direct social perception.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marek, for that introduction, and thanks for inviting me. So I'll be talking about the topic of direct social perception. I should say at the beginning, what I'll be talking about today is really the sort of classic epistemological problem of other minds. That is the question of if there's something going on in the environment over there, there's an animal, another person behaving, doing something in the environment, we perceive a person, we perceive another animal behaving. And the question is, how is it that we perceive another individual, as opposed to just, say, a mechanical series of jerks? Now, this phrase, direct social perception, has been gaining currency in recent years, particularly among some philosophers and phenomenologists. And the way that the phrase is often introduced is in negative terms. So as a rejection of inference-based accounts of how other minds, the perception of other minds occurs. Here's just three examples. So Shannon Spalding says that direct social perception is the idea that we can non-inferentially perceive other people's mental states. Joel Kruger says something similar. So he says, direct social perception challenges the widespread assumption that mental states are intracranial phenomena and they're perceptually inaccessible to everyone but their owner. So Joel Kruger's statement here is perhaps the most radical of the three here. And then Dan Zahavi at the bottom has a more conciliatory position. So he allows that there may be some instances in which we make use of inference and we make use of imagination to understand other minds. But these inference-based and imagination-based forms of mind reading presuppose something more basic. They presuppose a more direct form of social understanding, direct social perception. So those are three, at least partly negative, attempts to define what direct social perception is. What I'm interested in is whether it's possible to formulate an entirely positive account of what direct social perception is. That's what I'll be pursuing today. And the proposal here is that we should treat direct social perception as a hypothesis, and the hypothesis can be stated something like this. So animals perceiving of other animals in the environment, which includes their behavior, potentially properties about their mental life, their intentions. That perception is based on the detection of patterns in stimulus information. So here's an overview of the structure of the talk. So first of all, I'm going to start with a very classic film that you're perhaps familiar with, the Heider and Simmel study. And then I'll go into some of the background to that study, which will involve going through some things that the Gestalt psychologists said in the 1920s and 30s. And then at the end, I will present some examples that I think are useful prima facie evidence of the possibility of an empirical program in direct social perception. So first of all, the Heider and Simmel study. So this is a sort of mainstay of introductory undergraduate psychology. The study, quite likely that viewers have already seen this, but I'm going to show it anyway, just so that we're sort of on the same page. And so while I show the film, I'll read through Heider and Simmel's account of their sort of minimal account of the action that takes place in the film, which appears in the report. And the film, at least this version of it, sort of starts off. I think the first couple of seconds are missing, so it should start off with a big triangle moving into a house, opening the door, moving into the house, and closing the door behind it. That's where we join the action. The next, little triangle and circle are going to appear and move around the door. The big triangle moves out of the house and towards the little triangle. Big triangle and little triangle fight. Big triangle wins. And during the fight, circle moves into the house. And then big triangle moves into the house and shuts the door. Big triangle chases the circle within the house. Small triangle moves along the outside of the house towards the door. And little triangle opens the door, and circle will move out of the house, and the small triangle and the circle will close the door. Then the big triangle will seem to try to get out of the house, but not succeed in opening the door. Small triangle and circle move in circles around the house and touch each other several times. Big triangle opens the door and comes out of the house. Big triangle chases small triangle and circle twice around the house. Small triangle and circle leave the field. Big triangle hits the walls of the house several times, and the wall breaks. The action gets a bit fast towards the end. So that's the sequence of events from the description that I've just read. And so Heider and Simmel present this 12-point sequence as a kind of minimal description of the action. They acknowledge that they're using some anthropomorphic terms in this description, but they say it's sort of necessary to use those anthropomorphic terms in order to to produce a sort of understandable description of the action. So the question is, so why is this such a big study in the history of social psychology? Sort of not that amazing as a piece of film, but the reason it's sort of still used is because of the story that goes along with it. Here's a version of the kind of mainstream social psychology interpretation of the importance of this study. This is from Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. So Kahneman says, what viewers see an aggressive large triangle bullying a smaller triangle in a terrified circle. The circle and the small triangle joining forces to defeat the bully. They also observe much interaction around the door and then an explosive finale. But the perception of intention and emotion, our perception of intention and emotion in this film is irresistible. Kahneman says only people with autism don't experience this. And this is the sort of key claim here. So all of this takes place entirely in your mind, of course, says Kahneman. Your mind is ready and eager to identify agents and assign them personality traits and intentions, and to view their actions as expressing individual propensities. So the story that Kahneman's telling here is that there's nothing in the film itself that could give rise to our perception of agents of intentional behavior, but that those intentions have to be ascribed, have to be projected onto the film by us, the viewer. Well, if this is true, so if we take Kahneman literally, and perhaps a little uncharitably, and we take literally the phrase that the intentions are entirely in our mind, well, how do we then account for the fact that when different viewers watch this film, we kind of see the same thing, we kind of agree on what we're seeing? How do we account for the fact that Heider and Simmel in their report are able to give this 12-point account of the action, if the action is entirely in our mind? Well, one possibility that we could consider is that in the moving images, so maybe not in the forms themselves, not in the triangle and the circle and the line, but in the movement of the figures, there is in fact information. There's perhaps a rich sequence of information that a viewer can detect, and that is informative about these social properties, these intentions. So perhaps what's being left out of the account that Kahneman presents is the movements that have been put there by the animator. So the animator of the film is left out of the account, curiously. And there is some evidence, at least in the original report, that this is what Heider and Simmel were interested in. So they're not necessarily interested in the ascription of intentions by the viewer, but they're interested in how sequences, stimulus configurations is the phrase that they use, stimulus configurations that appear in the film give rise to certain responses. Okay, so now we're going to look at some background to that Heider and Simmel study. So Fritz Heider, the first author of that study, was a Gestalt psychologist. Marianne Simmel was a student, I think, at the time. The other author, but the sort of theoretical background comes from Gestalt thinking on this problem of how we perceive other minds. And perhaps the most persuasive passage that appears in the writings of the Gestalt psychologist on this problem is chapter 8 of Wolfgang Köhler's Gestalt Psychology. It's a textbook that originally appeared in 1929. So this is from that chapter. And here, so Köhler is going to reject a couple of what he takes to be standard explanations for how it's repeated. So first of all, here he presents a sort of standard version of the question. So how does it come to pass that we ascribe to others experiences more or less like those that we have ourselves? How do we perceive other minds? And then he considers the answer that is commonly given, that he says is commonly given by philosophers, the philosopher's answer. the way that philosophers answer is this. They say that since I cannot directly perceive what another person is experiencing, the only evidence that I have about that other person's experiences comes from his body, from observing his body. And then this is a continuation of what the philosophers think. So philosophers think that the only connection between my evidence, the evidence that I have about other people's experience, and those other people's experience that are not observable is indirect evidence. So it's based on the fact that specific experiences in myself tend to be accompanied by equally specific expressive alterations of a body. So in myself, this connection, I've become acquainted with this connection by the fact that various experiences in myself are correlated with certain movements and other changes in my body. And after frequent repetition of these experiences and movements, I'm able to draw an inference by analogy. So I perceive other people's movements and I infer that there's a similar experience going on inside that other person. But then Köhler rejects this analogy, and he rejects this inferential account by drawing an analogy with another similar logical move. So he talks about the possibility of there being life on other planets, or life on Mars. So he says here, from the fact that this planet, the planet Earth, is inhabited by organisms, we know that we live on a planet, this planet is inhabited. We could draw the inference that other planets also have organisms. So we could conclude that Mars must therefore also be inhabited with creatures. And clearly this inference is of the same kind as the one that we just talked about in the case of other minds. All we have is the observation of other people's behavior, and we draw a conclusion based on that. And then Köhler says, unfortunately, this astronomical parallel shows that inferences of this kind cannot be regarded as particularly reliable. He's rejected this the philosopher's explanation. And next he goes on to consider what he calls the psychologist's explanation, the psychological explanation. So he says, according to psychologists, psychologists have a slightly different explanation. The psychologists appeal to the constant repetition that establishes a strong association between our experiences and our bodily events, but this is a perceptual association. So we perceive our experiences, we experience our experiences, and we perceive our body. And as a consequence, whenever such bodily events take place in others, the corresponding experience will be at once recalled. So this is perhaps similar to a mirror neuron explanation in more modern terms. But Köhler rejects this as well. So this is the reason why he rejects this psychologist explanation. He says, if this theory were right, we should be unable to understand any behavior that has not frequently occurred in ourselves. And then again, the facts don't seem to agree with this conclusion. So he's saying that we should, if we've never been water skiing, for example, we should be unable to understand or make sense of what's going on when we see somebody else doing water skiing. So having rejected these two explanations, the philosopher's explanation, the psychologist's explanation, Köhler goes on to a partial defense of a behavioristic account of how we perceive other minds. He explicitly distances himself from some schools of behaviorism, from Watsonian behaviorism, but nevertheless he ends up with a kind of behaviorism. And his reasoning here is sort of anecdotal, so he appeals to his own experiences. He says, what happens when I go home on an evening? And I think about the contacts, the interactions that I've had with other people during the day. He says, what I find is that for the most part, it hasn't been particularly difficult to understand the people that I've been interacting with. And yet I feel sure that during these interactions, I've hardly been occupied with their inner experiences per se. and he says, now that I think of it, I can, of course, try and deliberately evoke pictures of the way that Mr. X and Mrs. Y probably have felt on this or that occasion. So it's possible to evoke what the experience of the other person might be like, but this is a kind of unnatural operation. I can do this. I can do it when I'm there together with these people, but during the effort, I realized that this is a very unfamiliar procedure, and plainly it's seldom something I do in normal social life. And then at the conclusion of this passage, he says that so when he tries to understand people in this artificial fashion of deliberately trying to think what their experience must be like, he says, I find myself concentrating mainly on people's voices and on their appearances, and also on what they talk about, the content of their statements. But again, I seldom translate the content of these statements into terms of subjective subjective experience. Apparently, I always forget to take the final step by which we're supposed to enter into other people's inner life. So I quite like this passage, an anecdotal description of Köhler's experience of other people's minds. So next we move on to Kafka. So Kafka, along with Köhler, is one of the foundational figures in Gestalt psychology. Kafka's main book, The Principles of Gestalt Psychology, was published in 1935, and Kafka, at the very end of this book, in the last chapter, has a short passage on the problem of perceiving other minds. And he takes Köhler's passage that we've just looked at as his starting point, and also a similar discussion from a Cambridge philosopher, C.D. Broad. So Kafka, at the beginning of his discussion, quotes kind of the conclusion from what Broad had said. And Broad, having also rejected the sort of philosophical explanation and the psychological explanation, or something like it, says that there are two possibilities. We're left with two possibilities. So it could either be the case that there just are certain cognitive situations where other people's minds or other animals' minds actually enter as objective constituents into my cognitive situation. So it could be the case that there's a sort of blending of cognitive states, which viewers may recognize as sort of redolent of certain inactive proposals, second-person experience, or participatory sense-making. Kafka, however, rejects this. He doesn't really consider it as a possibility. He doesn't take it seriously. And the reason that Kafka rejects it is because Kafka thinks it's just obviously the case that my experience doesn't mix with your experience, that I have a first-person experience, or in his terms, a behavioral environment that doesn't mix with the geographical environment. And there's never any confusion about where my behavioral environment is. So Kafka is left with only the second possibility of Broad's quote here. And the second possibility is that the visual appearance of certain bodily forms or movements, gestures or modifications, has for us an unacquired meaning. So what does that mean, to have an unacquired meaning? Well, so Kafka discusses this at some length, although it's quite a short passage, and he gives us the best example of something that we're viewing as having an unacquired meaning, is a Mickey Mouse film. So viewing a Mickey Mouse film. So in a Mickey Mouse film, there is objectively neither a motion or emotion. Objectively, there is only a mere sequence of drawings. But this sequence gives rise to objects in the behavioral world, that is, in the experience of the observer, which move and are agile or clumsy, exuberant or dejected. And then he continues, the merit of this example lies in the fact that here all of these characters, all of these properties of Mickey Mouse belong only in the behavioral objects. So they're only there in our experience, and they're entirely absent in the geographical object. The meanings which these forms and motions possess for us are therefore most clearly aspects or results of the psychophysical organization produced by the stimuli. So to paraphrase this, what a Mickey Mouse cartoon presents is information for the presence of an animate being, but there is no animate being. So there is no Mickey Mouse in the environment. Although Mickey Mouse exists in our experience, there is no actual whistling mouse up there. There is only the projected forms on the projector screen. And here, if we're going to give Kahneman a more charitable reading, as we should, we can read Kafka here as saying something sort of similar to what Kahneman says, where Mickey Mouse appears only in our mind. Except Kafka isn't quite saying that. Kafka is also allowing that there's a structure. There is a stimulus out there in the world that gives rise to our perception that has to be organized through psychophysical organization. And then towards the end of this brief discussion, Kafka offers this as a sort of first attempt at a formalization of how we should think about this problem of perceiving other minds. So this looks a bit mathematical, but isn't really. So we can read this as there's a person A and there's a person B, and B is the observer and A is the actor in the environment. And what the formula here is showing is that the emotions of person A map onto the movements of person A, which in turn map onto the retinal image in person B's eye, which then gives rise to something, perhaps person B's perception of person A, which is kind of where Kafka ends up in this discussion. So he says, well, maybe it's the case that if A subscript B, that is A as perceived by person B, is a more or less true map of the movements of person A, then we can understand that would be a kind of explanation of how B becomes aware of A's emotions. And it's an explanation without appeal to association or inference by analogy, which is what those original definitions of direct social perception were sort of asking for. Okay, so we've looked at two quite prominent discussions of the problem of the perception of other minds as presented by the main Gestalt psychologists. Heider is a little bit younger, is a few years younger than Kafka and Kohler, who are about 10 years older, about the same age as each other. Heider, so he is a contemporary of these other two figures, but his work appears a bit later because his main book, The Psychology of Interpersonal Relations, is kind of the last thing he wrote, really. He published it at the end of his working career in 1958. And in Heider, so this is from Heider's book, this passage. So here he's making a distinction between two different descriptions of this problem of experiencing other people's minds. So he calls them a phenomenological description and a causal description. And the phenomenological description is sort of consistent with the anecdotal account that Köhler gave in that passage that we read. So here's the phenomenological description. It's been stressed, especially by phenomenologists, that the person feels that he's in direct contact with things and persons in the environment. The person sees objects directly just by focusing their eyes upon them. He acts on objects directly by touching them and lifting them, and the same is true of person perception. So he not only perceives people as having certain spatial and physical properties, but he can also grasp even such intangibles as their wishes, their needs, emotions, and can do this by some form of immediate apprehension. So phenomenologically, it feels like we have direct access to the social characters of other people, to their personalities, to their intentions, in just the same way that we have direct access to the fact that there's a table over there in the room. But then he moves on to what he calls the causal description. And now the causal description depends on this distinction, which Heider was perhaps the first of the Gestalt psychologists to make this distinction, the distinction between the distal stimulus, that is the object over there in the environment, and the proximal stimulus, that is the pattern as it appears on the retina or potentially on the eardrum. So Heider says the distal stimulus does not directly affect the person. So the table over there or the other person over there doesn't directly causally interact with our body. Rather, that distal stimulus is mediated, for example, by light or sound wave patterns that excite our sensory organs. And it is this pattern, this stimulus pattern, impinging as it does directly upon the sense organs, that has been designated the proximal stimulus. This is the stimulus that is physically in direct proximity to the person. And then he says, well, different rules may apply for touch and taste, which is an interesting separate discussion, which we won't get into right now. And then Heider, so fairly early on in this book, he goes back and discusses this 1944 paper. So Heider is the same Heider as the Heider and Simmel paper, just to be clear. And he talks about this idea of stimulus configurations. And this discussion here is, I think, quite instructive. So Heider is presenting here sort of a potential ambiguity that appears in the film itself. So when we're viewing the film, during the film, the figures move in contact with the door. But in itself, this movement is ambiguous, Heider says. So it could be that the figure pushes the door, so the triangle pushes the door, or it could be that the door pushes the figure. He says there's no information in the film itself to distinguish between those two possibilities. The local stimulus, this movement alone, doesn't give any information about the origin of the movement. And nevertheless, the figures are always seen as pushing the door. I think this is an interesting sort of worry to have. And what's interesting about it is, well, why do you consider that as a possibility in the first place? I think if you take this example and then transfer it to real life, if you go and sit in a Starbucks and watch people entering the building or entering the Starbucks, you could have the same thought. You could think, well, I don't know if that door over there is just reacting to the person pulling on it, or if every time that somebody comes to the door suddenly springs into life and moves the person. I think this is not something that we consider in real life. Nevertheless, Heider thinks it's a sort of a relevant live possibility in the case of the film, which tells you something about sort of Heider's thinking, I think, sort of philosophical disposition. Now, this is also from Heider's book. Heider quotes a passage, and he quotes this passage approvingly. He quotes a passage from a chapter that James Gibson wrote in the early 1950s, which also touches upon this problem of other minds. So the way that Gibson poses the question is this. So he says, how do we perceive, for instance, that one person is being kind to another person, bearing in mind that we do this with some accuracy? How do we perceive kindness when we're observing people in the environment? How do we perceive the intentions and abilities of a political candidate, taking it for granted that this political candidate doesn't fool all of us all of the time? In other words, and I think this is the sort of key framing, what do we discriminate and what do we identify in these complex stimulus situations, in these patterns, these potentially dynamic patterns of stimulation, which, when conditions are favorable, yield a correct and accurate perception of what's going on in the distal environment? So Gibson says this question ought to be the primary line of inquiry, but instead it is almost completely neglected. And at this point, I'll just inject a biographical note. So the figures that I'm talking about here, there is a biographical connection between them. So at least James Gibson and Fritz Heider were lifelong friends, seemingly, and they were both colleagues together in the 1930s at Smith College in Massachusetts, where Kafka was also based. So they all knew each other. So there's a reason why they're all reacting to each other's work. So this is from a few pages later in Heider's book. And what happens here is sort of interesting. So it seems like Heider, just having presented Gibson's framing of the question, having presented this sort of psychophysical framing of the question, so what patterns do we need to detect in order to perceive the social properties of the environment? Heider seems to sort of just give up hope on the possibility of that as an empirical project. I think he sort of loses patience with it. And he ends up becoming more of a cognitivist. So he ends up with this passage. So in social perception, he says the influence of additional data that resist geometrical definition is often essential. And it seems that the most fruitful way to treat the process of social perception, the perception of other people, is to assume that there are intervening stages between the proximal stimulus, that is the pattern that is available on the retina, for example, and our perception, our experience of what that pattern means. So this would lead to the notion of a hierarchical process in which the proximal stimulus gives rise to more peripheral meanings, which in turn play the role of data for the higher levels of construction. So he ends up with quite an intellectualist, quite constructivist understanding of how social perception works. He just thinks that because of these problems like the door, the problem of there being a poverty of stimulus, of there being potentially ambiguous information in the film, therefore we need to add something. We as an observer need to add an interpretation to what we're looking at. So from Heider, I think a lot of the sort of history of theory of mind and the sort of Kahneman interpretation follows. What I'm interested in here, and what I'll end with, is the possibility of going back to the earlier project. So going back to the psychophysical project as presented by Kafka in that sort of quasi formula, and as presented, as indicated by Gibson. So what is it in the pattern? Can we identify patterns in the proximal stimulus or in the ambient optic array, in stimulus information, that are adequate, that by detecting those patterns we can potentially account for at least some of these seemingly quite cognitive feats of social perception? And I want to suggest that there are at least 6 dimensions of where it's useful to perceive social things that are going on in the environment. So first of all, it's useful to be able to discriminate animate behavior. So to be able to perceive that an agent is moving around as opposed to things just being static or merely mechanical movement. It's useful to be able to perceive reactivity or contingencies between one's own movement and reactions of other animals. It's potentially useful to be able to discriminate goal directedness, or what another animal is trying to achieve, what their behavior is directed toward. It's potentially useful to be able to detect other animals' emotional states, which may be connected to their goal directedness. It's potentially useful to be able to detect what we could call beliefs or other mental states, deceptive behavior, for example. And it's potentially useful to be able to detect personality or patterns in behavior over time. So here's an example which I think is prima facie evidence of the possibility that animals are sensitive to animate movement. This is a cat chasing a laser pointer. And well, we can ask a question here. So why is this laser pointer so interesting to the cat? Probably it has something to do with the way that the point is moving. So it has this a characteristic movement pattern, which is characteristic of animate movement. So the movement is imparted to it by the person's hand who is moving this laser pointer. Presumably the cat would be more interested in this kind of movement than in a static point that is just projected onto the wall, and potentially more interested in the animate movement than in a merely mechanical movement. So a point moving in a very predictable way. That's a hypothesis. I wasn't able to find any empirical literature on this problem. So I think there is a rich empirical program to be pursued in the how cats perceive animate movement in laser pointers. The next two examples are from football or soccer. So first of all, consider the problem of how a referee decides whether there's been a handball. So here we're thinking about the game from the point of view of the referee. And the referee has an interesting job to do, because the referee is called upon to make categorical judgment whether there has been a handball or no handball. So a real world example of someone being called upon to make a categorical judgment about what they're perceiving. So this is a passage from the laws of the game, and this is the current laws. So this is how handball is dealt with in the game currently. And basically, there are two possibilities for when a handball has taken place. So it's not a handball if just the ball hits the hand, but it just bounced there and the player couldn't get their arm out of the way. So traditionally, to be a handball, it has to be deliberate. There has to be a deliberate movement. So how do you decide if it's deliberate? Well, the way that it's operationalized in the laws now is, one possibility is that you can see the player's hand moving towards the ball. There's a movement of the hand towards the ball, which is perhaps what you see in this GIF here. Of course, it's often hard to detect. So in this case, you can see that the referee is behind the player, doesn't have a good view of it. So the existence of the stimulus pattern doesn't necessarily imply that the pattern is detected. The second possibility is that the offending player has their arm in an unnatural position, or in a position that is not justified by how they need to move it in order to play the game. So both of these definitions are quite behaviorist in the sense that Kohler perhaps was defending. So what these laws refer to is not the intentions, nothing going on inside the private mind of the individuals, but to observable things and therefore observable patterns. Now, the second example from soccer is to do with diving. So this is another judgment that the referee is called upon to make about whether there is an intent to deceive in order to gain an advantage. Here's a very famous example of simulation in soccer. This is Rivaldo from the 2002 World Cup. And what happens here is he gets hit by the ball in his leg. He goes down clutching his face. And the opposing player, the Turkish player, was actually sent off. It's a scandalous example from the history of international soccer. And we can see it's just looking at this, it's obvious why this is such sort of unsporting behavior. Now, this is something that has been studied by psychologists to some extent. So a paper from Morris and Lewis in 2011 looked at this problem. They showed viewers videos of potentially deceptive behavior by soccer players diving. And they found, what they found is that people are actually quite good at making this judgment about whether there's a deceptive intent, whether a dive has taken place. What do they make use of in making this judgment? Well, they make use of patterns that are detectable in the stimulus. So they make use of things like a lack of temporal contiguity between what happened and the effect. So as we saw in the slow motion video of Rivaldo there, the ball hits his leg, there's a pause, and then he adds his own behavior to the event and goes down clutching his face. And then there's the second one is a lack of ballistic continuity. So the fact that it hits him in the leg is not connected to what's happening in his face. So there's no continuity in the event, in the physical event. And participants, Morris and Lewis, they are able to detect this fact. So the intentions of the diving player manifest in the violations of the laws of cause and effect. And they say that the detection of deception in this context may be a relatively low-level perceptual process. So it may be based on the detection of patterns in stimulus information. So those are just three quite simple examples, which I present as prima facie evidence that it's possible to study, to pursue an empirical program into social perception that is based on detecting patterns in stimulus information. So already we have evidence that animals are able to detect animacy, if we think back to the cat chasing the laser pointer. We have evidence that animals are able to detect goal-directedness. So in the case of the handball, the laws of handball refer to movement towards the ball as evidence of deliberate goal-directed behavior. And we have evidence of the ability to detect beliefs and mental states. So the Rivaldo example is an example where we can see a deception taking place. The deception is available in the stimulus information. I think, so that's 3 of the 6 dimensions here that are, well, there's suggestive evidence here to say that those are tractable problems. I think the other dimensions are also potentially tractable. So that I refer viewers to this recent paper by Francesca Forley and Sarah Sangorian, which talks about emotional states, the detection of emotional states as a kind of Gestalt problem. It's a good paper from a sort of philosophical perspective. And I think the Heider and Simmel film is also prima facie evidence of our ability to detect personality. So remember Kahneman's description of that film as containing a bully. So here's where I'm going to sum up the argument. And I want to point out here a kind of competing pair of intuitions, a tension that has been running through the discussion that I've been talking about here. And the competing intuition is this: it's about how easy social perception is. The one intuition says that social perception is usually quite easy, quite straightforward. So we saw that in the Curler passage. where Kuhler said that for the most part, I find that it hasn't been particularly difficult to understand people that I've been interacting with during the day. And this is also evident in the Gibson quote, where Gibson poses the question this way: so how do we perceive that one person is being kind to another person, bearing in mind that we do this with some accuracy? That social perception usually works pretty well. So that's one intuition. The opposing intuition is that social perception is kind of fragile. Maybe it does work often, but it's always on the verge of breaking down, or that it only works because we're constantly working to make it work. And so that intuition seems to be evident in Heider, where he says that the influence of additional data that resist geometrical definition is often essential, and we often have to add our interpretation onto what we're seeing. It's also, this intuition is also, I think, evident in the Kahneman passage. So to conclude, I would pose the question this way. So the question that we've been considering is, to what extent can social cognition, or what we understand as social cognition, be accounted for in purely perceptual terms, or in terms of perceptual processes? And what I want to suggest is that this question is an empirical question. And addressing this question is something that we can only do if we go back to that earlier program of seeking patterns in information that can potentially specify social properties and give rise to our perception of the social environment. Thank you.
That's great, Ed. Thank you very much. So we were sort of running a little long, so we've got a little bit of time for discussion. So I would, Mark, if you have any sort of immediate questions, just feel free to jump straight in. I'm going to keep an eye on comments from YouTube here. So I'll just throw in one from the chat from Elena Kufari. It's just a fascinating talk. Thank you for the wonderful references, actually, to these aspects of Gestalt psychology. So it's interesting to see making those links. And I guess we before we came on air, we were discussing the links between Gibson and the Gestalt psychologists. So it's interesting to see you start sort of weaving those threads together. I wonder if I could ask one quick clarificatory question, and then I'll sort of hand over to Mark if Mark wants to join in. I see he's unmuted himself, so it looks positive. And then I'll also transfer in comments from Elena or others from online as we go. So the quick clarification question, you parsed it twice during the talk, but I guess I'm just curious as to whether Heider was explicit. So when you refer to Heider's additional information, you've parsed it as our interpretation of the geometric information. And I'm just wondering, is Heider explicit about that, or is it a little bit more ambiguous as to what kind of additional information he's talking about?
I think he's quite explicit about it. Yeah, the sort of the first 3 chapters of that 1958 book seem to be quite, they seem to be sort of poised between the possibility of going cognitive and sticking with the sort of Gestalt Gibson approach to the question. But then after that, he just sort of gives up on the question of perception and goes into sort of folk psychology, what we now call folk psychology. He talks about naive psychology. He's just sort of given up on the question of stimulus configurations, I think. And another thing about that book is that he's only interested in human perception of other humans, I think. So whether other animals, other animals clearly do detect patterns that are informative about other animals, and it's quite useful to be able to detect those patterns. Heider isn't interested in those. Doesn't seem to be interested in those. He very much concentrates on the sort of social life, which I think is sort of becomes so much so much wrapped up in human language that it's sort of quite a different question that he's interested in after those initial chapters.
Thanks, Ed. So, Mark, I'll let you come in here, and I'll feed in Elena's comments as she's raised a couple of points here in the chat, so I'll feed those in a bit.
So, Ed, thank you very much indeed. It's very interesting, very clear presentation. Thank you so much. The thing that struck me at the beginning was that this business of stimulus configuration is a very static picture, it seems to me, and unnaturally static.
Mm-hmm.
And if we take real people interacting into account, or even real animals, it's very rarely static. So you always have more to go on, perhaps, than that initial sort of stimulus configuration, or however you want to class it.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. So the reason it's possible to tell the Kahneman story of, isn't it strange how these simple shapes give rise to these complex interpretations, is because there's an ambiguity there that he's probably only referring to the triangles and the squares, but not to the movement of the shape.
Which seems to me crucial. And one other thing, just briefly, I found myself coming back to the example of the theatre.
Yep.
In theatre, we have a large group of people watching people on the stage who are conveying, if you like, mental states that they don't actually have, probably. But the audience seems to have no sense of difficulty in doing this. And indeed, if something sudden happens on the stage, the audience responds, as one. This is not a calculated process. Yeah. This is a sort of direct. It seems to me it's a direct response.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah, that's an interesting example, and it's the kind of example that Heider spends a lot of time thinking about once he's dealt with this initial perceptual issue.
So I think that's supporting your hypothesis, by the way.
Okay, well, thank you for supporting my hypothesis. And I think similarly, I take Elena's point as similarly supporting it, though raising for consideration a little bit more about the richness. So a big part of the story here is how rich the information available in the world is. And Elena's pointed out online here that the focus throughout the talk, and it's a traditional ecological psychology focus, is almost entirely on visual perception. Whereas in the case certainly of social interaction, there are a lot of other aspects to the interaction. So she says, I just wonder about the centrality put on visual perception, since we do not look directly at interactors that often, or exclusive in other ways, sensing them physically or being with them. So I'm wondering what you'd say about other facets of social perception, like perceiving group identity, or moral perception, like perceiving injustice or goodness.
Yeah, and it's certainly a relevant point to say that the focus has been on visual perception and on sort of distal perception. So I deliberately dangled a couple of places in the talk where this might come up. So there was a Heider passage where he referred to vision and hearing as distal senses, but touch and taste as proximal senses. Well, there's a whole discussion there about whether sort of touch and taste really are proximal senses. But so the reason that I've focused on the distal perception is because I think it is a problem. So it is a problem of how we perceive action over there, how we observe other people, how we observe actors or a magician on the stage, and we're able to understand what's going on. This is something that we do. There is a tendency in some of the sort of existing work that goes under the banner of direct social perception to sort of deny, I think, that the perception and action and interaction can be separated at all. But I think once you bring in interaction things get much more complicated. Or it's in a sense, well, certainly for humans, interaction is a more fundamental process, but it's much more complicated to analyze. And the reason for that is because, but here I'll go back to those two possibilities that Kafka entertained. So the possibility of other people's mental states entering into my cognition, which he rejected on the grounds that I still have a first-person experience. What he doesn't consider is the possibility so he rejects the possibility that our perceptual systems are merged. What he doesn't consider is the possibility that our action systems are merged, which I think clearly they are in everyday social interactions. So if you shake somebody's hand, there is a merging of action systems, undeniably. There are physical forces that enter into the handshake that are not being imparted into the handshake by me. And yet I have a first-person perspective. So I think there's a way to reconcile Kafka's sort of first-person experience-based treatment of this problem of other minds with the more inactivist, interactive, the Dan Zahavi we experience account. And it is to make a distinction between perception and action. So I think I want to insist that there is a distinction that needs to be made, and that the perceptual problem is an interesting problem in its own right and can't be subsumed under the interactive problem.
If I'm going to come back, this is not representing Elena now, this is just me responding to what you just said there, because it was one thing that struck me when you quoted Kulla on this one as well, which is that it seems to me that there's an unnecessarily entire separation of the first person perspectives, when all that we really need to say is that any two first person perspectives cannot wholly overlap. So insofar as we share an environment and insofar as we both experience the same environment, there is a real sense in which our experiences are merged. Yeah. And that there is also aspects of my experience over a given period of time that you do not share does not mean that nothing about my experiences is available to you, or that everything about my experience is excluded, and vice versa. So the sort of absoluteness of that differentiation that Kulla wants seems overstepping to me, and it also means that, for example, you don't necessarily have to make that perception action split in order to resolve the issue, but what you do need is a negotiation over time if you want to find some kind of coordination between the two.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't really know how to respond to this at some point. It's like it's quite difficult to talk about this kind of idea that our first person experience in some sense merges, that in some sense there is a we experience. And this, the philosophers are. There is work underway in Copenhagen, Dan Zahavi's group, to exactly this problem. So it's keeping people occupied.
Yeah. That's fair enough. I do want to come back to Elena's other point, though, if that's all right, which is the broader point. So there is the richness of that interaction is an important one, but there are also what we might consider. So you've looked. And your focus really was on looking at maybe what are the minimal cases or simpler cases, but Elena introduces other cases which are explicitly relational, I think. So and that's me putting words that aren't necessarily representative of her question, but maybe kind of seeding the discussion. Perhaps rudely, I apologize if so. But so in introducing notions of moral perception, of perceptions of injustice or goodness, is there an opportunity here, or is there enough information in the world to directly perceive that kind of thing too?
So directly perceiving justice or group membership. So here's another thing where I'm sort of not sure on what my intuitions are. In some ways, I want to say that all of that is just human language entering into our understanding of the world. So we have the notion of justice, but it's just an inherently linguistic notion, like whether something is just or unjust is a linguistic categorization that we make. And I kind of feel the same way about group membership. So the existence of group boundaries is to some extent, I think, based on naming of ourselves and other people as belonging to a group, which is a linguistic activity. But then there's a competing intuition from the sort of the ape literature that says, well, there's group formation in ape coalitions, and perhaps chimpanzees have a sense of fairness, so they'll get angry if another chimpanzee is given more reward. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question. It's an interesting.
I guess there's an interesting question to the extent to which relations are directly perceivable, and it also gets back. Elena mentions in a comment here as well that it can be helpful to think about the difference between interaction and, as you say, what's essentially spectator perception as its own phenomenon that needs to be sort of separated and examined as an independent thing. So keeping these sort of problems separate from one another, even though they're related, is often a useful analytical practice, right?
Yeah, and I think certainly we do just observe without interacting. That's quite a common mode of being for animals. Animals that have to monitor their own environment for sort of potential predators, potential threats, are doing a kind of social perception. But it is an observational mode of perception and not necessarily an interactive mode. And if it does become an interactive mode, that's when things become threatening. But I think there is a difference there.
Okay. So I appreciate we're soaking up an awful lot of your time. Mark, I'd just give you a quick opportunity to come back in if you want any final comments. Are you happy? Okay. That's good. Well, in that case, Ed, I would say thank you very much for giving us your time and for the excellent talk, and loads of food for discussion. I look forward to the paper coming out whenever, if it's already in draft form or if it's
partly there's the beginnings of a paper.
We'll certainly look forward to it, and I appreciate you giving your time today.
Thanks for inviting me. This was fun.
So thanks very much, everyone, and we will see you again soon for another ENSO seminar.